When my mom remarried after my dad passed, I was 14. Too old to be naive, too young to fight back. The man she married, Richard, had that kind of cold charm you only notice after it's too late. He wore expensive watches, drove a black Lexus, and always had this smug half-smile that said he was doing the world a favor just by existing. He had a son, Kyle, 1 year older than me. Golden boy, varsity jacket, expensive sneakers, the kind of kid who thought poor was a personality flaw. When I first moved into their house in the Connecticut suburbs, I was trying to be hopeful. It was big, clean, full of light. A world away from our old apartment where Mom and I used to eat dinner on the couch. But that house never felt like home. My room was the smallest, tucked beside the laundry area, and Richard's voice would always echo up the stairs. "Kyle, dinner's ready." Never boys, never kids, just Kyle. I became the ghost that lived in the wrong hallway. Mom would smile at me with tired eyes and whisper, "He just needs time." But I think she knew. That house had already chosen its favorites. The years passed with invisible scars. I stopped asking for things. Kyle wrecked his car at 17, a Mustang Richard bought him, and somehow I got blamed for not warning him about a slick driveway. When I got straight A's, they said nothing. When Kyle passed gym class, they threw a barbecue. My mother's laughter turned quieter every year, until one day it just stopped. A brain aneurysm, sudden, cruel, and final. She died at work while I was in class. I remember sitting in that cold hospital hallway, Richard's voice dry and businesslike. "She had no life insurance. We'll have to handle the estate." He said it like I wasn't even there. I was 18, scared, and too trusting when he said, "Sign these papers, it'll make things easier." They were property transfer forms. Mom had left me her share of the house, but I unknowingly signed it away. Within weeks, Richard said it was time for me to find my own path. Kyle helped me pack my things in trash bags, smirking as if throwing me out was a team-building exercise. When I walked out of that driveway, all I had was 2 bags, a crumpled photo of Mom, and the kind of silence that burns itself into your bones. I promised myself one thing. One day, I'd come back. Not with anger, with precision. Boston taught me anonymity like a second language. I stocked boxes on graveyard shifts, slept on a mattress that complained louder than I did, and ate the kind of dinners you buy with nickels and stubbornness. But I fed on other things too. County clerk websites at 2 a.m., foreclosure notices, quiet case studies of men who turned paper cuts into paper fortunes. I got my real estate license, then my broker's, then a certificate in property finance that I printed on my one good sheet of paper and pinned above the desk I'd built from 2 milk crates. I learned how liens stack like bad decisions, how property taxes become a snake eating its tail, how a house can look solid from the curb and still be hollow as a lie. I made a habit of visiting courthouse auctions just to watch. Who shows up early? Who leaves first? Who pretends not to know who's bidding against them? I worked for a flipper who thought I was invisible until I became useful. I watched him lose $80,000 on a kitchen he tried to turn into a yacht club, and I watched him make $200,000 on a 2-family he repaired like a surgeon with a stopwatch. I learned the only rule that mattered: profit belongs to patience. By my late 20s, I had a firm that existed in whispers: consulting, acquisitions, quiet assignments, nothing flashy. A thin website, a P.O. box, 3 LLCs with names as bland as cereal. Every check I wrote to my future felt like an apology to the 14-year-old who slept by the washing machine. When I finally pointed my car south toward Connecticut, I wasn't returning as a son. I was returning as a ledger. The house looked smaller than memory had sworn, slouching behind a tired maple like it needed the tree to keep it upright. The shutters peeled in strips,
The lawn had given up the argument. I parked a block away and watched from the anonymity of an early evening commute. Richard, shuffling down the driveway in a robe at 5 p.m., bringing in the mail like it weighed more than dignity. Kyle in gym shorts at noon on a Tuesday, smoking the kind of cigarette you hold like a complaint. Back at my rental, I laid out what I already knew from public records. 2 years behind on property taxes, a home equity line maxed, a contractor lien for a half-finished bathroom, an HOA fine for a fence change they never requested permission for. There was also a small claim from a lawn company Kyle stiffed the summer he said he was starting a landscaping brand. The sum total was a choir of unpaid favors. I didn't want to crush them with the weight of everything. I only needed to give gravity a nudge. I created another holding company, Bridgeview Capital Partners, the kind of name that sounds like it has a glass lobby and a receptionist who says, "One moment, please." I had a local attorney, one who'd never met me, float a polite letter. "Interested in purchasing your property as is. Cash. Close in 21 days. We'll handle all liens and fees." The number I offered was surgical. High enough to feel like oxygen to a drowning man, low enough to be an insult to anyone who'd ever really loved that house. Richard bit. Of course he did. He'd always preferred short-term relief to long-term math. When the acceptance email came through, I stared at the screen a long time, not with triumph, but with the quiet of finally touching the edge of a bruise. We opened escrow on a Wednesday. By Friday, the title report sang the sad ballad I expected. By Tuesday, my attorney had negotiated down 2 liens and arranged a tax payoff plan that wouldn't matter because I would pay it in full at closing. Richard thought he was escaping a trap. He didn't realize he'd said it himself years ago, the night he slid papers toward a grieving kid and said, "This will make things easier." The morning of closing, the sky had that clean winter blue you only get when the air's ablade.
I wore the one suit that fits me like a decision. In the conference room, the attorney placed a neat stack of documents between water bottles that no one touched. Richard sat across from me and squinted, as if staring through a windshield he refused to defrost. Kyle slouched beside him, thumb tapping out a rhythm on his phone screen. They hadn't been told who the buyer was. No rule says you must, but the moment has a way of introducing itself. "Buyer's representative?" the paralegal asked. I slid my ID forward, then a business card with my name, my actual name, etched in the kind of minimal font that doesn't apologize for itself. Richard's lips moved before his brain did. "No," he said softly, then louder, like volume could bully truth. "No." Kyle looked from me to the papers, a furrow knitting his face like a beginner's scarf. "This is a joke," he said. No one laughed. The attorney, professional to the bone, explained the chain of entities, the assignment from Bridgeview to my personal trust, the payoff wires queued like planes on a tarmac. "It's all compliant," she assured, a sentence built for men who didn't read what they signed. Richard tried to muster the old superiority, the lecture tone, the banker's cadence, but his voice sounded like an overdraft notice. You can't do this," he said. "You can't take my house." I felt something shift in me, not gloat, not pity, just a long exhale I'd been saving for a decade. "You sold it," I said, "to the highest bidder willing to clean up the mess." Kyle stood up, like anger could make him taller. "We have rights." "You do," I said. "You have 30 days of post-closing occupancy per the addendum you initialed. You'll receive cash for keys when you leave the place in broom-swept condition. That was your request, remember?" The addendum had been my idea, disguised as a favor. A month to move, with a small stipend at the end if they respected the house on the way out. It was mercy written in legalese. Richard's eyes grew glassy, then narrow. "You planned this." I met his stare the way a tide meets a dock, steadily, inevitably. "I learned it," I said, "from you." He reached for a pen with a trimmer that made a tiny music against the table. Signatures splashed across paper like surrender flags. The wire confirmed, deed recorded, keys transferred.
There's a point in every closing where the room changes temperature. The instant ownership shifts from concept to law. I felt it roll through the air like a winter front. The paralegal gathered the copies. The attorney offered a handshake that said, "Both congratulations and I don't ask questions." Richard hovered by the door, unsure if he should be dignified or angry or both, and ending up with neither. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked, the way you ask what someone intends to do with an old photo of you smiling. I could have said flip it. I could have said keep it as a rental. I could have said burn it to the ground and dance in the ashes. Instead, I told the smallest portion of the truth. "Fix what's broken," I said. Kyle opened his mouth to spit something, then thought better of it and swallowed. Outside, the cold hit our faces like a judge's gavel. Richard fumbled with the remote for the car he couldn't really afford anymore. He paused, stared at me, a look searching for the boy he used to overtalk and finding a man who didn't need to raise his voice. "You always were ungrateful," he said. But it didn't land. The words fell between us and cracked like thin ice. I let them lie. Revenge, when done properly, isn't noise, it's paperwork. As they drove away, the winter sun flashed on the windshield and then was gone. I stood there a moment, keys in my palm, the cool bite of the metal warming against my skin. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. The lock turned with an old sound I recognized from another life. The house exhaled stale air and secrets. I stepped over the threshold, not as a guest, not as a boy hoping to be invited to dinner, but as the owner. Somewhere inside, the washing machine thumped its one-note prayer. "I'm back," I said to the quiet, and I brought a broom.
For the first few nights, I didn't sleep much inside that house. The air still carried the ghosts of old habits. The creak near the pantry where Richard used to drop his keys. The faint outline on the wall where Mom's framed diploma once hung. I walked the rooms with a flashlight, every corner whispering a memory I didn't ask to hear. In the laundry room, my old room, the ceiling still had a water stain shaped almost exactly like the map of the state I'd escaped to. The washer thumped in the dark like it had been waiting for me. I stood there until the quiet turned kind, then pulled the plug. The next morning, I met the contractors I'd hired through the company. None of them knew I was the owner. "The client wants it restored, not flipped," I told them. "Keep the bones, fix the heart." They nodded, scribbling notes, already dreaming in drywall. The smell of primer and sawdust began to replace the dust of neglect. Every nail driven into the frame felt like punctuation on a story that had waited too long for its next sentence. While work went on, I'd kept to my office downtown, pretending the place was just another project. But something in me needed to see the end of the old ghosts. I drove by after hours once and saw a familiar car parked down the street. Richard's Lexus, the same one he'd bought when I was a kid. He sat behind the wheel, headlights off, staring at the house. I didn't approach him. He looked smaller now, the robe replaced by a jacket that hung too loose, like the weight of the years had hollowed him out. The next day, a neighbor told me Kyle had been ranting on Facebook about family betrayal and stolen property. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some people never understand that consequences are just debts with long due dates. 2 weeks later, the contractor sent me pictures. New floors gleaming, walls clean, sunlight cutting through open curtains like forgiveness. I framed one photo on my desk, the living room where Mom used to sit reading in the afternoons. It looked peaceful again. For the first time, maybe ever, so did I. When the permits closed and the final invoice cleared, I walked the house one last time before moving the furniture in. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. I opened every door, every window, letting light chase out what had lingered too long. On the front porch, the mail slot clinked. A single envelope slid through. No name, just my address. Inside was a photo. Me and Mom, the year before she died, sitting by the garden she loved. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words. "She'd be proud." No signature, but I knew the script.
Richard's. I folded it carefully and left it in the same drawer where she once kept her recipe cards. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't need to. The house remembered who it belonged to now, and that was enough.
The house felt different after the silence returned. There's a rhythm that comes only when construction stops. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of a new clock finding its heartbeat, the echo of your own footsteps across clean floors. I stood in the doorway of what used to be Mom's room and looked at the sunlight filtering through the curtains. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was trespassing in my own memory. The smell of fresh paint had faded into something softer, like paper and lemon oil. I placed her old photo on the nightstand and sat for a while, letting the quiet fill the space where anger used to live. A month after the renovations ended, a letter came from the county office confirming the house's reassessment. The value had doubled. I could have sold it for profit, turned the page, moved back to Boston and called it victory, but I didn't. I rented out the upper floor to a quiet couple who'd just had their first baby and needed a start. Downstairs I kept a small office, a desk, a bookshelf, a framed title deed with my name printed clean and simple across the top. Sometimes I'd hear the baby crying upstairs and think about the nights I'd lain awake at that same age, wondering what I'd done wrong just by existing. That sound didn't bother me. It reminded me that life was still being written, even in places that once felt like endings. One Saturday afternoon, as I was repainting the porch railing, a car pulled into the driveway. It was the same black Lexus, older now, one headlight dimmer than the other. Richard stepped out slowly, cane in hand. He looked thinner, smaller somehow, his sharpness worn into a quiet sort of exhaustion. I didn't say anything at first. He stood by the gate, eyes on the porch. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was cracked but gentle. "It's your step," I said, and opened a gate. We sat on the porch like two men waiting for weather. He looked around, taking in the new siding, the trimmed hedges, the same maple tree now stretching taller than the roofline. "You fixed it," he said. I did. He nodded slowly, staring at the street. "It looks peaceful." "It is." We didn't talk about the past, or the papers, or the years lost between us. We didn't need to. After a while, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photo, the same one he'd mailed me weeks ago. "I wanted to give you that in person," he said. "She'd have liked what you did here." His eyes were wet, but not weak. "I wasn't kind," he added, "to her, or to you." I looked out over the yard, where the grass had grown back greener. "You gave me lessons," I said. "Not kindness, but lessons." He nodded again, hands trembling, and after a few minutes, he stood to leave. "You've built something good," he said. "Don't let it turn into what it was." "I won't." After he drove away, I stood by the porch railing until the sound of the car faded. The house creaked lightly in the afternoon wind, settling around me like an old friend stretching after a long nap. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about taking back what they'd stolen. It was about restoring what they'd broken. The boy who used to sleep beside the washing machine was gone. The man who stayed had built his own foundation, brick by brick, word by word, until the house no longer held pain, only peace. That night, I walked through each room again, lights dimmed, letting the shadows of the walls fall just where they used to when Mom would read under her lamp. I whispered goodnight to her picture, locked the front door, and stood for a moment on the porch. The air was cold, the stars indifferent, but everything felt still. They said I was just the stepson, but this was always home.